When I was 8 years old, my family moved into a creaky old house in a quiet suburb of Cleveland. It wasn't run down, but it had that undeniable sense of history. Wooden floors that groaned underfoot, wallpaper that seemed just a little too faded, and a basement that my dad jokingly called a dungeon. It was the kind of place where your footsteps seemed to echo even when the house should have been empty. The basement freaked me out from the start. It was dark, even during the day, and the single bulb dangling from the ceiling cast more shadows than light. My mom used it for storage, boxes of old clothes, Christmas decorations, and a strange assortment of furniture the previous owners left behind. One of those was an antique rocking chair, which I swear moved on its own sometimes, though my parents said I was imagining it. One evening, about a month after we moved in, my dad asked me to grab a toolbox from the basement. I didn't want to go, but I didn't want to seem like a baby either, so I went down there, flashlight in hand. As I rummaged through the shelves, I heard something faint. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again. A low, almost rhythmic creaking sound. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The sound was coming from the far corner of the basement, where the rocking chair sat. I told myself it was just a draft, but as I turned to shine my light on it, the chair was still. Perfectly still. No movement, no creak. I laughed nervously at myself and grabbed the toolbox. As I turned to go back upstairs, I heard it again, this time louder. Creak, creak, creak. I turned around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. The chair was rocking, back and forth, slow and deliberate. And then it stopped. I bolted upstairs and slammed the basement door behind me, toolbox forgotten. My dad found me pale-faced in the living room and gave me grief for spooking myself. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house seemed louder, more deliberate. And when I finally did doze off, I dreamed of the chair, rocking away in the dark. But the worst part? The next morning, when my dad went to get the toolbox, he called me down. "Hey, you left the flashlight on," he said. I didn't remember dropping it, but when I went down, there it was, lying on the floor with the light shining directly on the rocking chair. And sitting in the chair was a small, stuffed rabbit I didn't recognize. I stared at the rabbit, trying to remember if it was one of my old toys. It was dingy, with matted fur and one of its button eyes hanging by a thread. I didn't recognize it, and neither did my parents when I asked them. Maybe the previous owners left it, my mom suggested casually, but I couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't there before. That night, I dreamed of the basement again. This time, the rabbit was in my dream. It sat in the chair, unmoving, until it turned its head toward me. Its dangling eye swayed as it tilted its head, and though it didn't have a mouth, I swear I heard it whisper, "Come play." I woke up drenched in sweat and begged my parents to let me sleep in their room. They told me I was too old for that, but my mom let me leave the light on. A week passed without incident, though I made a point of avoiding the basement. My dad teased me about it, but I didn't care. Then, one night, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Creak, creak, creak. It wasn't a dream this time. The sound was coming from directly beneath my room, where the basement was. I buried myself under the covers, praying it would stop. But then I heard something worse, footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate. Each creak of the wood made my chest tighten. I wanted to scream for my parents, but my voice caught in my throat. Then the footsteps stopped. My bedroom door didn't open, and nothing happened for what felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek out from under the blanket. The room was dark, but everything seemed normal, until I glanced at the foot of my bed. The stuffed rabbit was there, sitting upright, its single eye glinting in the dim light. I screamed, and my parents came rushing in. They flipped the lights on, but by then, the rabbit was gone. My dad checked the house and found nothing. They told me it was just a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. The next day, I begged my dad to get rid of the rocking chair. He finally agreed, probably just to calm me down. He hauled it to the curb for the trash pickup, and I watched from the window to make sure it was gone. That night, For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. A few days later, we got a knock at the door. It was our neighbor, an older man who'd lived in the area his whole life. He said he recognized the chair and wanted to know where we'd gotten it. My dad explained we'd found it in the basement when we moved in. The neighbor's face grew pale. "That chair belonged to the Thompsons," he said. "They lived here before you. Their little girl used to sit in it all the time, holding her favorite toy, a stuffed rabbit." My dad asked why they left it behind. "They didn't," the man replied. "Their daughter died in the house. They buried the rabbit with her. We moved out a month later. To this day, I can't stand the sound of a rocking chair." When I was 10, my family lived on the edge of a sprawling forest in rural Pennsylvania. The trees stretched endlessly behind our house, their dense canopies blotting out the sun even on the brightest days. I used to play there with my younger brother, Ryan, building forts out of fallen branches and daring each other to venture deeper into the woods. It felt like a private playground, though my mom always warned us not to wander too far. One chilly autumn afternoon, Ryan and I decided to explore a part of the forest we hadn't been to before. The air was crisp, and the fallen leaves crunched underfoot as we trudged through the underbrush. We were laughing and chasing each other when we stumbled upon something odd. A clearing with a single, massive oak tree at its center. The tree was unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was twisted and blackened, as if it had been struck by lightning, yet its branches were full of vibrant, golden leaves. What caught my attention most, though, were the carvings etched into the bark. Hundreds of tiny symbols and what looked like names spiraling up the trunk. "Cool," Ryan said, running up to touch it, but the moment his hand brushed the bark, the air seemed to change. It grew heavier, colder, and the forest around us fell silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, eerie quiet. I grabbed Ryan's arm. "Let's go," I said, my voice trembling. He hesitated but nodded, and we turned to leave. That's when we heard it, a whisper, faint at first, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Did you hear that?" Ryan whispered. I nodded, gripping his hand tightly as we started to walk faster. The whispers grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a chorus of voices, rising and falling, some angry, others pleading. My heart pounded as we broke into a run, crashing through the trees until we finally burst out of the forest and into the safety of our backyard. We didn't tell our parents about what happened. I wasn't even sure how to explain it. That night, as I lay in bed, I convinced myself it was just the wind. But then I heard it again. The same whispers, faint but unmistakable, drifting in through my open window. The whispers were soft, almost like a lullaby, but there was something unnerving about them. I shut my window and locked it, pulling the curtains tight, but the sound didn't stop. It felt like the voices were inside my head, growing louder as the night went on. The next morning, I told Ryan about it, expecting him to laugh or call me crazy, but his face turned pale. "I heard them too," he admitted. "They were calling my name." We decided to stick together after that, avoiding the forest entirely. For a few days, things seemed normal. No whispers, no strange occurrences. I started to think we'd imagined it all. But then Ryan started acting different. He became quiet, withdrawn. He'd sit by the window for hours, staring out at the forest as if waiting for something. When I asked him what was wrong, he'd shrug and say he was fine, but his eyes looked hollow. One night, I woke up to find his bed empty. Panic set in as I realized the window was open, the curtains fluttering in the cold breeze. I ran downstairs, calling his name, and found the back door ajar. The sight made my stomach drop. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and sprinted into the forest, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. I shouted for Ryan, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. Then I saw it, the clearing with the twisted oak. Ryan was standing there, his hand pressed against the bark, just like the first time we found it. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his lips were moving, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. "Ryan!" I screamed, running toward him. As I got closer, the whispers returned, louder than ever, swirling around me like a cyclone. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were angry, accusatory. I could make out fragments of sentences. "Why did you leave? Come back. You promised." I grabbed Ryan's arm and yanked him away from the tree. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. I don't remember how we made it back to the house, but the next thing I knew, we were in the kitchen, gasping for breath. Ryan was shaking, tears streaming down his face. "They want me to stay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They said I belonged to them." I didn't know what to say. We never went back to the forest after that. My parents thought it was just a phase when we stopped playing outside, but Ryan and I knew better. Over time, the whispers faded, and Ryan slowly returned to his old self. But to this day, I can't look at a tree without feeling a shiver run down my spine. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear them. When I was 11, my family rented an old farmhouse in upstate New York for the summer. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time. Weathered wood, creaky floors, and a faint smell of mildew no matter how many windows we opened. I wasn't thrilled about being stuck in the middle of nowhere, but the house had one redeeming feature: a massive attic filled with forgotten treasures. The attic quickly became my escape. It was packed with trunks full of old clothes, dusty books, and strange knickknacks. I spent hours exploring, making up stories about who had lived there and why they'd left so much behind. But there was one part of the attic I didn't like: a small, locked door on the far wall. It was about the size of a cupboard, painted an unsettling shade of green. It had no handle, just a rusted keyhole. The door gave me an uneasy feeling, like it didn't belong. I asked my dad about it, and he said it was probably just a crawl space. "Old houses have all kinds of weird little doors," he said. But that didn't explain why it was locked, or why, when I pressed my ear against it, I thought I could hear faint scratching sounds. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I borrowed a bobby pin from my mom's vanity and tried to pick the lock. I had no idea what I was doing, but after a few minutes of fumbling, I heard a soft click. My heart raced as I pulled the door open. Behind it was a narrow, dark passageway. The air that spilled out was cold and smelled of damp earth. I shone my flashlight inside, revealing wooden stairs that led down into darkness. The stairs were rough and uneven, clearly not part of the house's main construction. I hesitated, but the urge to explore was too strong. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended. The flashlight beam wavered, revealing a dirt floor and low wooden beams overhead. The space was cramped, like a cellar, but there were no shelves, no wine racks, just a single wooden table in the center of the room. And on the table was a row of porcelain dolls. The dolls were arranged in a neat line, each one staring straight ahead with painted eyes that seemed far too lifelike. Their porcelain faces were pale and cracked in places, as if they'd been sitting there for decades. Some had chipped noses, others were missing fingers, but all of them seemed to share one unsettling feature. Their expressions weren't neutral. They looked scared. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped closer. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. That's when I noticed something else. A faint humming sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere deeper in the passage. It wasn't mechanical, nor did it sound like wind. It was rhythmic, almost like a person humming a song. I wanted to leave, but my feet refused to move. My gaze was locked on the dolls, and for a moment, I thought one of them had turned its head. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but the humming grew louder, more insistent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, plunging me into complete darkness. I screamed, my voice echoing in the confined space, and bolted up the stairs, flashlight clattering to the ground. I pounded on the door, yelling for my parents, but it wouldn't budge. The humming had stopped, replaced by a new sound, soft, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs behind me. In sheer panic, I threw myself against the door, and finally, it gave way. I stumbled into the attic, slamming the door shut and locking it. My parents found me minutes later, sobbing and shaking. They didn't believe my story. My dad said the door had probably stuck because of the humidity, but I refused to go back in the attic for the rest of the summer. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of scratching at my bedroom door. It was faint, irregular, like fingernails scraping wood. I froze, too terrified to move, until the sound stopped. The next morning, when I worked up the courage to check, the green door in the attic was open again. I told my parents I wanted to go home, and they chalked it up to me being homesick. But that wasn't it. I wasn't homesick. I was afraid. Something about that door, that room, those dolls, wasn't right. We left the farmhouse at the end of the summer, and I never went back. Sometimes I dream about the attic, and in my dreams, the green door is always waiting, slightly ajar. And behind it, I hear the humming. When I was 9, we moved into a 2-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac in a small town in Indiana. It was a nice place, bigger than our last home, and I was excited to have a room of my own. My bedroom faced the street, with a large window that overlooked the front yard. I liked to sit by it and watch the neighborhood, especially in the evenings when the streetlights cast a soft glow over everything. One night, about a month after we'd settled in, I was sitting by the window, reading a comic book, when I noticed something strange. Across the street, in the house directly opposite ours, a man was standing at the upstairs window. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, and his face was pale and blurry, like it was out of focus. At first, I thought he was just staring out at the street, but then I realized he was looking directly at me. I froze, unsure what to do. The man didn't move, didn't wave. He just stood there, motionless. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light, but when I looked again, he was still there. Feeling unsettled, I closed my curtains and went to bed. The next morning, I mentioned it to my mom, but she brushed it off. Probably just one of the neighbors, she said. No need to worry. That night, curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked through the curtains. The man was there again, in the same spot, staring at my window. This time, I noticed something even stranger. His head was tilted at an odd angle, almost like he was hanging there. I slammed the curtains shut and crawled into bed, pulling the blanket over my head. For the next few nights, I avoided looking out the window, but the feeling that he was there, watching, wouldn't go away. Finally, after a week of sleepless nights, I worked up the courage to look again. When I pulled back the curtain, the window across the street was empty. Relief flooded over me, and I laughed at myself for being so scared. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw something in the corner of my eye. The man was now standing in my front yard, looking up at my window. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. He stood perfectly still, his pale face just barely illuminated by the streetlights. I wanted to scream for my parents, but I was paralyzed with fear. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, the yard was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, made my heart race. The next morning, I told my dad about what I'd seen. He frowned but didn't seem overly concerned. Probably just a trick of the light, he said. But I'll check around the house tonight, just to be safe. True to his word, my dad walked the perimeter of the house after dinner, shining a flashlight into the bushes and under the porch. He didn't find anything unusual, but he reassured me that everything was fine. If you see him again, come get me, he said. That night, I didn't want to look out the window, but I couldn't help myself. I inched the curtain back, expecting to see the empty street or maybe the man across the way. Instead, I saw him standing in my yard again, closer this time, just at the edge of the light spilling from the street lamp. I bolted out of my room and ran to my parents' bedroom, tears streaming down my face. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and stormed outside, but when he came back, he was shaking his head. "There's no one out there," he said. "You're just imagining things." But I wasn't imagining it. Over the next few weeks, the man kept appearing. Sometimes he was in the yard, sometimes across the street. Once, I even thought I saw him in our backyard. I stopped looking out the window entirely, but I could still feel his presence, like he was there, just beyond the glass. The worst night came about a month later. I woke up to the sound of tapping on my window. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I slowly turned my head. He was there, his face pressed against the glass. His pale skin was stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes, if you could call them eyes, were hollow and dark, like empty sockets. I screamed, and my parents came running. By the time they got to my room, the man was gone. My dad called the police, but there was no sign of a break-in, no footprints in the yard. The officers chalked it up to a bad dream. We moved a few months later, though my parents said it had nothing to do with the man. I never saw him again, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that face at the window. I wonder if he's still out there, staring at someone else, waiting to be let in. When I was 8, my family moved to a small town in Oregon. There wasn't much to do there, but a block from our house was a tiny playground. A swing set, a rusty slide, and a merry-go-round that squeaked when it spun. It wasn't much, but to a kid, it felt like a world of possibilities. I spent hours there after school, usually by myself. The other neighborhood kids were older and didn't seem interested in the playground anymore. But one day, while I was swinging, I saw another kid sitting on the merry-go-round. He looked about my age, with dark hair and a red jacket that was too big for him. He wasn't spinning the merry-go-round or even sitting on it properly. He was perched cross-legged on the edge, staring at the ground. "Hi," I called out, but he didn't respond. I hopped off the swing and walked over. "What's your name?" I asked. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and startled, like he hadn't realized I was there. "Peter," he said after a long pause. "Want to play?" I asked. Peter didn't smile, but he nodded and followed me to the swings. We didn't talk much after that, but I didn't mind. It was nice to have someone to play with. Over the next few weeks, I saw Peter almost every day at the playground. He was always quiet, but he'd play tag or push me on the swings if I asked. The strange thing was, he never seemed to go home. He was always there when I arrived, and when I left, he'd still be sitting on the merry-go-round, staring at the ground. One afternoon, I asked him where he lived. He hesitated. "Around," he said, which I thought was a weird answer. "Do you go to school?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." That night, I told my mom about Peter. She frowned and asked what he looked like. When I described him, her face went pale. "That sounds like Peter Grayson," she said slowly. "But that's not possible." "Why?" I asked, confused. "Because Peter Grayson died 5 years ago." I stared at my mom, waiting for her to laugh or tell me she was joking, but her expression stayed serious. She explained that Peter had lived in our neighborhood before I was born. He was around my age when it happened. One summer, he went missing. After days of searching, they found him at the playground, at the bottom of the old slide. He'd fallen and hit his head. They said he liked to play there alone. My mom added quietly, "It was his favorite place." I didn't know what to say. Part of me thought she must have been mistaken. There had to be another boy named Peter. But the next day, when I went to the playground, I couldn't stop staring at the merry-go-round, where Peter usually sat. He wasn't there. I waited for him all afternoon, but he never showed. When I told my mom that evening, she looked relieved. "Maybe it was just your imagination," she said, but I could tell she didn't believe it either. A few days later, I saw Peter again. He was sitting on the merry-go-round, staring at the ground like always. I almost didn't approach him, but curiosity got the better of me. "Peter?" I asked softly. He looked up, his face pale and serious. "I can't stay long," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why not?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the slide, his expression sad. "I shouldn't be here," he said finally, "but I liked playing with you." I didn't understand what he meant, and before I could ask, he stood up. "Don't come back here at night," he said firmly, his dark eyes meeting mine. "Promise me." "I promise," I said, though I didn't know why he was so insistent. He nodded, then walked toward the edge of the playground, disappearing behind the trees. I waited, expecting him to come back, but he didn't. That was the last time I saw him. A few weeks later, my dad took me to the playground to help clean it up for the town's summer festival. As we raked leaves and picked up trash, I told him about Peter. I expected him to laugh it off, but he just nodded thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "after Peter died, some people said they'd see him here, sitting on the merry-go-round, watching." I felt a shiver run down my spine. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Peter's warning. I never went back to the playground after dark. And even now, as an adult, when I pass by an empty park at night, I can't help but glance toward the swings and the merry-go-round, half expecting to see a boy in a red jacket staring at the ground.